And we have the U.S., a colossal ruling power, the greatest global power since Rome, with more reach. The U.S. and Americans believe that their leadership in the period since World War II is what accounted for the international order that we've all lived in. We're now entering the 81st year without a great power war. This is the longer period of peace since Rome.
The United States turns 250 on the 4th of July, a quarter of a millennium after declaring independence from Britain. It remains the world's largest economy. It spends more on defense than the next several countries combined. Its companies dominate global technology, finance, and entertainment. Yet this milestone comes at an uneasy moment. Confidence in Congress sits at around 10%. America's Surgeon General has described loneliness as an epidemic, and only about 1 in 4 Americans believe their country is headed in the right direction. Abroad, Washington is grappling with the fallout from the Iran conflict, its support for Israel, and intensifying competition with China, as well as growing questions about America's role in NATO and the wider world. So, as the US of A turns 250, what's its state of health? Is it fit for the future or starting to show its age? I'm Genevieve Wu. Joining me for this discussion is our senior correspondent in Washington, D.C., Simon Marks, who is incidentally joining me from London right now. Simon, I guess your location is somewhat appropriate, given that the U.S. is celebrating its independence from, Britain, and also going through its own political turmoil. I want to start by noting that the run-up to America 250, that 2 images have stood out, right? The controversy surrounding the reflecting pool, one of America's most iconic landmarks, the UFC Freedom 250 spectacle on the White House grounds. Now, for some Americans, these 2 stories on one hand symbolize, government incompetence, populist excess. For others, it's a little more than, partisan arguments blown out of proportion. It's just a renovation hiccup, right? Only $15 million. What's the big deal? So through the lens of these images, what does it say about America at 250?
Well, look, Jen, first of all, yes, I am in London. I don't know about America showing its age, but I think I'm showing mine. And I was thinking the other day that I've lived in the United States for the last 35 years. So I've actually been there for more than 1/10 of the country's existence, which is kind of staggering when you think about it. I mean, the reflecting pool and the president's decision to host that UFC championship contest on White House grounds have become sort of a symbol of the country's culture wars, the country's disagreements, and the manner in which President Trump particularly is choosing to embrace a patriotic spirit this 250th anniversary year that he believes is symbolic, particularly through, the sort of aggressive, pugnacious, violent imagery that you see in those UFC tournaments of an America whose luster he is seeking to restore. We're hearing a lot of talk about American culture. And by that, Donald Trump has a very, very specific kind of definition that many people challenge and say, well, his culture is a muscular, male, largely white culture, not redolent of the multicultural tapestry that is modern-day America. So I think also it's important to underscore that particularly that UFC bout is an issue because there are moral and ethical questions about it, given that the president has investments in the parent company of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. The reflecting pool is emblematic also of questions that are raised about the Trump presidency, the nature of the president's determination, an admirable determination, millions of Americans would argue, to beautify and upgrade the sights and scenery in the American capital. But this is hallowed ground. It lies at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. It's due to serve as one of the centerpieces of America's 250th birthday celebrations. And the accusation, of course, is that in his rush to get this job done, through no-bid contracts that went to donors, one particular donor of Donald Trump, a neighbor of his at Mar-a-Lago, were corners cut here in his determination to get that reflecting pool redesigned to his particular spec. And what does that mean for the place that it's going to play in America's 250th birthday? I asked Professor Todd Belt of Georgetown University in Washington, who's its Director of Political Management, whether these debates over the reflecting pool and America's 250th anniversary, including the UFC, had become something bigger than just a discussion about architecture and pageantry. And here's what he had to say.
We always see that when Donald Trump gets cornered on issues that he doesn't like, he retreats to issues that he does like the ballroom and the arch and the reflecting pool, because at the heart of it, Donald Trump is a builder and a real estate person, and that's where he's most comfortable talking about things. He's also trying to produce a lasting legacy with his name on a number of different buildings and such here in Washington, D.C. So he's really concerned with how he will be thought of as a president years on, and that's driving a lot of this as well.
So, clearly there's all these partisan views, of course, not limited to the reflecting pool and the UFC freedom type of celebration. Pew Research has also found partisan animosity in America near historic highs, and this is bleeding over to daily life. What does that look like for us? Paint that picture.
Well, I mean, it's complicated and it's definitely on the rise, and you can see it in family relationships and working relationships. There are families where all over the country, political divisions over support for President Donald Trump or support for the radical left, as President Donald Trump likes to call it, left-wing Democrats, democratic socialists now increasingly to the fore in the opposition party. There are real stresses and strains that lead to families having breakups, people not talking to one another, huge difficulties in the workplace. There are millions of people who try to avoid talking about politics in social or family circles because they want to avoid those kinds of tensions from coming to the fore.
Actually, I'm going to jump in here real quick because I've got family in the U.S. too. And, we have relatives and cousins who are on one side of the divide and we are on the other side of the divide. And when we go to family gatherings, we say, is so-and-so going to be there? If they are, we're not showing up. So, well, my husband's American, so he calls the shots. I'll just go to whatever party, right? But to that point, it is really happening.
Yeah, and it is really happening. It's a real shift in American society, underscored, by the way, in the changes in which we all communicate. Because, of course, increasingly Americans now exist in their own particular ecosystems of social media or bigger media, TV, radio, and they are able in the United States to exist in a bubble where they are only hearing news and information and stories that they want to hear about rather than any kind of broader analysis from people that they might oppose. So that contributes to all of this as well. I have to say that another cause of polarization, particularly in cities on the eastern seaboard, relates to the Middle East. If you look at the primary contests that have just been held in New York, by Democrats who are seeking to win seats to Congress later this year, they've been absolutely dominated by really polarized discussion arising out of Gaza, the events of October the 7th, all of those issues fueling some of these divisions. And then there are laws that are fueling divisions. So some states now have put such restrictive abortion laws in place that it's a crime in those states to travel across state lines to try and procure an abortion. If you look at the culture wars that are taking place, for example, over diversity, equity, and inclusivity, we've seen advertising boycotts of prominent brands like Bud Light because it put out a brief TikTok involving a transgender model. Of the store Target, there's been a customer customer boycott there over the shop's commitment or lack of it to DEI. Universities finding themselves in the center of these culture wars, and it's changing the nature of the country and creating, I think, an increasingly febrile atmosphere, very brittle, in which a country whose lawmakers used to come to Washington, realizing that they were being sent there to get stuff done, to get into what were smoke-filled rooms, and even where they volubly disagreed about things, to try and find common ground in the interests of passing laws for the American people. All of that's gone. The tribalization of politics, which is reflected in these polarized personal relationships that you find within families, within workspaces, all of that is changing the character of the country.
Absolutely, right. And so to that point about, they are keeping to their own bubbles, is this echo chamber of the news and the information that they get that reinforces, I suppose, their own biases and perhaps prejudices. So, which links me to confidence in institutions, right? There's a Gallup poll that says confidence in Congress is now hovering at 10%. Now, this collapse in trust, paint it out for me. What does it look like? And when Americans stop trusting institutions, who fills the vacuum?
Well, it's very real. It's very significant. We talk a lot about President Trump's plunging approval ratings, but the approval ratings of members of Congress are substantially lower than President Trump's. And by the way, the approval ratings of Democrats in Congress as a group are substantially lower than those of President Donald Trump. I mean, to some extent, Congress is carrying the can for President Trump's determination, wherever possible, to do an end run around it. Go to war against Iran without consulting Congress, use Congress basically as a rubber stamp for the things that he wants to get done, and then refuse to sign other bills into law unless they advance other things that he wants to get done. So Congress itself has become a less relevant institution, which is a staggering thing to say, because, of course, it's one of the three co-equal branches of government. The Supreme Court, the judiciary, is the other of the three, including, of course, the executive, the presidency. But as President Trump has kind of supercharged the presidency to see whether there are any limits to his power, and he argues there are none, the Supreme Court, because of its now 6-3 Republican-appointed justices to Democratic-appointed justices, its inbuilt conservative majority is also often serving as a rubber stamp for Republican desires. Not always. We saw the tariffs decision, which of course upended the central pillar of the Trump administration's economic policies. But that too is playing in to this notion that institutions are failing. And that's before you get to private institutions, the Fourth Estate, the media, supposedly a critical aspect of the checks and balances that lie at the heart of America's democratic experiment. And 250 years in, it is still an experiment. And with so many of those guardrails being tested and in some cases being found wanting, that is further fueling this disillusionment that people have in the equilibrium that previously existed in the United States.
All right. And, from this disillusion, this low level of trust in institutions and establishments, this cynicism, I suppose, in these institutions, that leads us to another challenge, right, facing America today. America's Surgeon General has described loneliness as an epidemic and warns that its health risks can rival smoking. Now, how much of America's anxiety today is actually social rather than, say, political?
Well, I think a lot of it is social, and there are areas where the social and the political come together. So if you look at the policies that are being advanced, for example, by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that has clearly accelerated vaccine skepticism in the United States, resulting in measles outbreaks, the likes of which the country hasn't seen in a very long time, lower uptick in the number of vaccines that infants are getting and often not completing the cycle when newborns arrive. So there's
apparently he has made it optional. That used to be mandatory, some of these childhood vaccines. It's now optional.
Yes, cutting
it?
back
Yes, right.
the numbers dramatically and wherever possible, including options in that. And, you know, that, of course, is having huge impacts on public health in the United States, with some of RFK Jr.'s opponents fearing about where that's going to go. I mean, you can argue that election skepticism and election denial contributes psychologically to where the country finds itself. But this loneliness is also related to where we are technologically as a society. Everybody's on their phones all the time. Everybody's in their own particular chat circles. They're in their own particular Instagram account, reaching the people that they reach. They are, as I was saying earlier, consuming media in different ways, and it's media that often speaks to their own particular prejudices. We don't have the great sort of common shared experiences anymore that you traditionally had in the days when basically there were 3 television networks, cable TV hadn't been invented, and you decided whether your biggest decision was, am I going to go with ABC, CBS, or NBC? I think it's also worth briefly mentioning the manosphere, which is a big issue in America. You know, people, young men, being influenced by online figures who are telling them that there is a way that you need to act if you're going to be a man in the 21st century. That's also having a big impact on society in these unregulated social media and internet circles where people find themselves. So I think it's hugely problematic because social media is largely replacing traditional community, and community is coming under assault as a result of that.
Let's step outside America's domestic pressures for now and look at that. You know, let's talk about the United States' strategic rival, right? We can't talk about the U.S. without talking about China, naturally. Now, China produces roughly a third of the world's manufactured goods. And when Americans look at China today, it's all this anxiety. What worries them most about China?
They look at it largely through an economic prism and through the challenges that it presents to the United States. But if you look, for example, at the trade war that's been taking place. I mean, clearly, both President Xi and President Trump have stepped back from the brink. They're trying to find pragmatic ways of resolving the issues between them. We're going to have President Xi visiting the United States in September for this reciprocal state visit that President Trump has invited into. That's going to be a huge deal in the bilateral relationship. There's obviously grave concern over semiconductors, over Chinese AI versus American AI. Who's going to win the battle for AI? Many analysts argue that China is better positioned to win it because it can rely on cheaper access to the power that AI demands, whereas the United States has to find ways of accommodating with its current grid and then expanding its current grid as quickly as possible. There are now some private companies developing privately owned small nuclear power plants in a bid to try and meet that demand. So that's going to be the real competitive nature of that bilateral relationship going forwards. Farming is, for the United States, obviously hugely important, and gaining access to the Chinese market. President Trump often heralds, particularly in terms of soybean exports and the like. But let's see where that goes, whether the Chinese actually buy as many of those products as the United States hopes to sell. So I think for Americans, it's primarily about the economic challenge that China poses, with the superpower rivalry taking a backseat, but still an important seat in the minds of Americans as they wonder whether the United States is going to remain, as Vice President J.D. Vance has recently continued to call it, the world's only superpower, or whether that's already a very outdated notion.
Right. Now, we've spent some time talking about, how the U.S. or Washington views Beijing or China. I'm going to flip that around a little bit. I spoke to political analyst Dr. Adrian Ang from S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and I asked him how America looks like from this side of the Pacific on its 250th birthday. Let's have a listen.
So there is a very complicated view of the U.S. from the region, which really is not surprising. The United States has introduced its values, promoted democracy, freedom, free markets, and the U.S. has also sort of used its military dominance, its hegemony to ensure sort of peace and security in the region. But what has happened, of course, over the last 10 years or so, beginning with the first Trump administration, is that sort of those certainties have changed markedly. The U.S. has sort of beginning to close the door to commerce, So the Trump administration has introduced tariffs. There are questions about America's reliability in terms of being sort of the offshore balancer, and increasingly sort of countries in the region are viewing the developments in American domestic politics, especially polarization, as affecting America's ability to be a stabilizing power in the region.
Simon, one thing that strikes me, while China represents a long-term challenge, America is also simultaneously dealing with a lot on its plate, right? So we're talking about Iran, Israel, NATO, a growing list of global responsibilities. Now, American defense spending has hit some $1 trillion a year. Iran war has been costly. There's a Ukraine overhang, a rethink on European deployment. Indo-Pacific priorities also on the radar. Does America at 250 still want these responsibilities and the costs, of course, that come with being the world's policeman?
Well, it depends, of course, on which America you're talking about. Barack Obama's former national security advisor, Ben Rhodes, has actually been here in London this week promoting a book and absolutely making the case that the Democrats are waiting in the wings to swoop back in once voters get a chance to weigh in on the future of the United States and return the country's foreign and defense policy to what he would argue is some sense of normalcy and normality. On the other hand, you look at the extent to which President Trump has cast doubt about the future of America's security umbrella for Europe. You look at what is still, I think, a threat to the NATO alliance, very unclear as the Pentagon now goes through this 6-month review of the American force posture in Europe, the extent to which they're going to keep as much military resource here as they currently have in place. And, reversing some of those things, if they are pushed through, will not be easy. Any future government here in London, in Paris, in Berlin, current leaders are, of course, all thinking about what they need to do to boost their own defense infrastructure because they are realizing they cannot necessarily any longer rely on the United States. And with regard to the American force posture in the Indo-Pacific, there are still questions about that. The abiding question, of course, over Taiwan and what the United States would or would not do were there an effort to bring Taiwan back under the aegis of the mainland while Donald Trump was in power. And they are complicated by Iran, because what he did in Iran was exactly what he told Americans and the world that he would not do. He was not going to get drawn into far-off conflicts, right?
He had positioned himself as the president of peace, right? Remember, just before he came back?
Absolutely. Yeah, presiding over the board of peace. This is all about ending wars, not starting them.
Starting wars. Mm-hmm.
And so many observers believed that we were going to see, if not isolationism, which I'm not sure has ever been what Donald Trump is all about, because he's not really an isolationist. What he is someone who's passionate about American dominance in the Western Hemisphere, in America's own backyard, Latin America particularly, maybe even including Greenland, because they argue that is Western Hemisphere territory. But then Iran upends all of that and makes you wonder if there is any operating principle for determining the outcome of any particular foreign and defense policy decision on any particular day.
We've covered a lot of ground, Simon. We've talked about eroding trust, deepening polarization, loneliness, China, and of course America's role in the world. So let's go back to where we started. And before I get your diagnosis, let's hear what two analysts told us when we asked them a very simple question. What's the single biggest challenge that America faces today at 250? Let's have a listen.
The biggest challenge for the United States is to restore stability with our neighbors and with our own people. Donald Trump likes to govern in a way that is very chaotic and causes a lot of uncertainty. And that's not good for international relations, and it's not good for U.S. businesses, and it's not good for the U.S. population. And you can see that a lot of these self-inflicted wounds, such as the tariffs going up and down and changing all the time, a lot of the international escapades like the international war have just made things worse. So trying to repair these self-inflicted wounds on the U.S. economy and trying to be a better neighbor internationally.
If we went back, sort of 50 years ago, right, to the celebrations in 1976, then President Richard Nixon was trying to make those celebrations all about him as well. There was also, right, sort of some sense of right, having the blues, right? Because if we think about it, right, in 1975, right, sort of this was just with the fall of Saigon. So America was celebrating barely a year after, right, sort of it had lost the war in Vietnam, right? There was the oil shocks from the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. There was stagflation. There was malaise. So, right, sort of even the celebrations to some extent occurred under a cloud. There are some differences, obviously. So, right, sort of if America 50 years ago was also, I think, right, sort of a much less complicated, much less contested country, and America today has to decide, right, sort of what does life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness mean for Americans today, right? But this is also occurring under a very different, right, sort of political environment or mood, right, which is really about the culture war. So what it means to be American, who is American, is now, right, sort of highly contested, highly polarized, highly political.
So, Simon, after everything that we've discussed and, listening to those two perspectives, what's your diagnosis? If you had to pick one issue, what is the single biggest challenge facing America at 250?
Well, I'm going to say something that you, I suspect, won't hear anywhere else. And it surprises me that you don't hear it anywhere else. But I think one can advance the argument that the biggest challenge the United States faces is its own constitution. As the country is celebrating its 250th anniversary, we will once again hear much hallowed talk about the sanctity of that document that was crafted by America's founding fathers. But the reality is there are huge questions about its efficacy and whether it is fit for the modern era. Just before we started recording this podcast, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling that eviscerates a law in Hawaii that says that there should be restrictions on whether you can walk into any business in Hawaii carrying a gun. And the Supreme Court now says, no, there's no restrictions on that whatsoever. You want to walk into any shop, any department store, any office in Hawaii, and therefore presumably by inference other states across the country, bearing arms, you can absolutely do that. If you look at just the issue of guns in America and the inability of the country to deal with that crisis because of the Second Amendment to the American Constitution that says Americans have the right to bear arms, now translated into Americans have the right to bear AR-15 assault rifles, that's catastrophic for American society. The late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before her death, a couple of years before her death, she was asked by a group of Brazilian constitutional scholars who were looking at constitutional reforms in Brazil whether she thought they should model their reforms and changes around the American Constitution. And she said, absolutely not. It's completely out of date. It's unfit for purpose. You should look at the South African Constitution because it's a much more modern post-apartheid constitution reflective of a much more inclusive society. You don't hear anyone in the United States advocating for a constitutional convention, for a really serious discussion about whether this document, rooted in the lives and times and practices of the 1770s, is relevant to 2026, much less 2076.
You know, Simon, I'm going to see your diagnosis and I'm going to raise it, okay? Because it's what I think is related to what you're saying, this crisis facing the state of the Constitution. What I fear is, given the deep and the bitter rifts that we see now that's dividing the country, I think possibly the biggest challenge for U.S. is averting another civil war.
Well, I completely agree with that. I think that, the conservative broadcaster Rush Limbaugh, shortly before he died, Donald Trump's favorite broadcaster, made a very controversial broadcast in which he argued that it is impossible to imagine that people living in New York or California can continue to coexist with people living in Idaho or Wyoming or, other parts of loyally Republican territory. And, was even talking in terms of the concept of secession. And I think that a huge test is going to be whether this republic, filled with people who disagree with one another, in many cases disagreements across geographical boundaries, whether those communities can continue to coexist peacefully, I think is a really huge question in a country where everybody is polarized, everybody is inflamed, passionate about their own particular viewpoints, and so many of them have access to weaponry. And that's obviously a huge danger that lies ahead.
Especially now, like you said, I can carry an AK assault rifle when I go to Walmart grocery shopping,
Absolutely.
can't I? Right. If nothing else, we've discovered that even at 250, right, America still knows how to throw a good party, Simon. Okay? I'm looking forward to the fireworks on the 4th of July.
The fireworks will be fantastic. There's no doubt about
Right?
that. And I'm sure that the one thing that we can testify to without fear of contradiction is that the fireworks will be great. I mean, I think, the celebrations themselves have got a patina of politicization, which is why some people are choosing to stay away. But the party on the day is going to be good.
All right, we can look forward to that. And on that note, it is a birthday after all. Happy birthday, America. Here's to the next 250. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the CNA Correspondent Podcast. It's brought to you by Tiffany Ang, Nat Vetavero, Craig Dale, Zikri Ayman, and me, Genevieve Wu. Bye for now.